In the small town of Riverbend, a tragic tale unfolded that would leave the community in shock. Lila Reed, a dedicated professional and loving wife, was found dead in her office at the age of 31, a victim of despair. Lila's death was initially ruled a suicide, but a journal discovered during the investigation hinted at deeper troubles, including a secret affair between her husband and mother. As the truth emerged, the consequences of their actions led to public shame and profound guilt. How could betrayal within a family lead to such a devastating end? Lila Reed, 31 years old, was a woman who seemed to have it all. She was driven, successful, and deeply committed to her career at a corporate firm in the city. Balancing her professional and personal life had never been easy, but Lila was determined. Ryan Reed, 35, worked from home. His flexible hours seemed ideal when Lila's career began taking off. But as time passed, he started feeling the impact of her growing absence. Ryan misses the closeness they once had. The long, quiet days at home leave him feeling increasingly isolated. While he remained loyal to Lila, he couldn't help but feel neglected. Susan Collins, Lila's mother, was in her late 50s. Attractive and still full of energy, she had been widowed for several years. The loss of her husband left her lonely, and despite keeping a busy social life, she found herself emotionally needy. Lila Reed had always been ambitious. At 31, she was the breadwinner of the family, excelling in her corporate job in the nearby city. Her career was something she was proud of. She had worked hard to get where she was, climbing the ranks through long hours and dedication. Lila often spent her days in back-to-back meetings, navigating high-pressure projects, and staying late at the office to meet deadlines. Despite the stress, she managed to balance her home life with her professional responsibilities, or so she believed. Even when exhausted, she tried to check in with her husband, Ryan, and keep their marriage afloat. But the demands of Lila's job were relentless, and as the months passed, she started to bring her work home. Late-night emails, missed dinners, and canceled weekend plans became more common. Though Lila cared deeply for Ryan, her focus on career advancement unintentionally pushed him to the background. She was often too tired or preoccupied to notice the growing distance between them, and her long workdays started to take a toll on their relationship. While she assumed they'll get through this phase, the emotional gap kept widening. Ryan, on the other hand, felt this change deeply. Working from home had seemed ideal at first, allowing him more flexibility while Lila pursued her career. But now, the quiet house was a daily reminder of how alone he's become. The early days of marriage were filled with shared conversations, plans, and affection. Now, with Lila's long hours at the office, Ryan found himself spending most of his time alone. His work didn't demand much social interaction, and without Lila around, his days started to feel empty. Ryan's loneliness grew with each passing week. He craved the connection they once had, but Lila's absence left a void. Nights that were once filled with conversation were now spent waiting for her to come home, often too late for any meaningful time together. As Ryan struggled to cope with the emotional distance, his need for attention and companionship intensified, leaving him vulnerable in ways neither he nor Lila could foresee. At first, Susan's visits seemed harmless, even helpful. As Lila's mother, Susan began stopping by their home more frequently, offering to help with chores and keep Ryan company while Lila worked long hours. Ryan appreciated the gesture. Susan's visits gave him someone to talk to, breaking up the silence that had taken over his life. What started as simple, friendly visits soon became a regular part of Ryan's routine. Susan would drop by during the day, sharing coffee, conversation, and small tasks around the house. For Ryan, Susan's presence eased the loneliness he had been feeling. She listened when he talked about his frustrations, and in return, she offered support and understanding. As weeks went by, Ryan found himself looking forward to these moments with Susan. They shared stories about Lila, their shared concerns for her well-being, and the challenges of life. What initially felt like harmless companionship started to become something more. Meanwhile, the emotional distance between Ryan and Lila was growing. Lila, consumed by her career, rarely had the time or energy to notice the bond forming between her husband and her mother. Her long workdays left little room for personal connection, and Ryan, feeling increasingly neglected, found in Susan the attention and warmth he had been missing. The emptiness Lila's absence created was slowly being filled, not by her, but by Susan. As Susan's visits became more frequent, the boundaries of their relationship began to blur. What started as comfort between in-laws slowly took on a different tone. Small moments, a lingering glance, a shared laugh became charged with a quiet intensity. Though neither Ryan nor Susan addressed it openly, there was a growing closeness that was difficult to ignore. The line between family and something else was starting to shift, and neither seemed willing or able to stop it. It started with small gestures, almost innocent at first. Susan would compliment Ryan in ways that felt different from the usual mother-in-law pleasantries. She would touch his arm a little longer than necessary, give him lingering glances, and joke about how lonely they both were with Lila working so much. At first, Ryan felt uncomfortable, unsure of how to react. But over time, his resistance weakened. He was already starved for attention, and Susan's playful flirting filled a void he had long felt. Slowly, he began to reciprocate. Their conversations became more charged, the casual touches more deliberate. What started as subtle flirtation began to cross into dangerous territory. It wasn't long before Ryan and Susan gave in to their attraction. They began meeting in secret during the day, when Lila was away at work. While Ryan struggled with guilt, he was also drawn to the thrill of their affair. Susan, too, knew it was wrong, but was swept up in the excitement of it all. They were both fully aware of the betrayal, but in the moments they were together, they managed to push the guilt aside. The affair escalated quickly. Susan would visit the house under the same pretext, helping around while Lila was at work, but her true intentions were far different now. In the quiet hours of the day, when the house was empty, they continued their secret relationship. Both felt the weight of their betrayal, but were equally caught up in the rush that came with their hidden meetings. Meanwhile, Lila, though tired from her demanding job, began to notice small, unsettling signs. A lipstick-stained glass left on the kitchen counter, the scent of her mother's perfume faintly clinging to Ryan's clothes, or Susan's personal belongings left behind in the bathroom. Each clue was brushed off as an innocent oversight. After all, Susan had been visiting frequently, and Lila assumed her mother was just helping out around the house. But the unease lingered, a nagging feeling in the back of her mind that something wasn't quite right. As Ryan and Susan's affair deepened, their guilt simmered just below the surface. Yet, with every secret encounter, they became more reckless, unaware that the signs of their betrayal were starting to pile up, waiting to be discovered. The tension in the Reed household was becoming impossible to ignore. Lila, exhausted from her demanding job, began to notice subtle but unsettling changes in Ryan and Susan's behavior. When all three of them were in the same room, there was a clear discomfort between Ryan and Susan. They avoided making eye contact with each other, and their once easy conversation had turned awkward and strained. Susan, who had always been chatty and affectionate, now seemed distant, and Ryan appeared nervous, as if he was constantly on edge. At first, Lila tried to push her worries aside. She told herself they were just tired, or maybe even stressed about her long hours at work. But the more time passed, the more she sensed something was wrong. Every small interaction between Ryan and Susan seemed laced with a quiet tension. The way they spoke around her, the sudden silences when she entered the room, it all deepened her anxiety. Lila began to feel like an outsider in her own home, and she couldn't shake the growing suspicion that something was being kept from her. Then came the phone calls. One afternoon, Lila, feeling uneasy, tried calling Ryan several times from her office. There was no answer. Her mind started racing. She then tried calling her mother, hoping for some reassurance, but Susan didn't pick up either. The sinking feeling in Lila's stomach grew heavier with each unanswered call. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong, and a terrifying thought started to form in her mind. Was it possible that her mother and her husband were together, behind her back? Unable to ignore the mounting dread, Lila grabbed her keys and rushed home. She drove through the quiet streets, her heart pounding with fear and uncertainty. The distance between her office and home had never felt so long. Something deep inside her knew that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. The signs had been there for weeks, but she had refused to see them. Now, as she sped toward her house, she was certain the truth was about to reveal itself, and nothing could prepare her for what she might find. Lila arrived home unexpectedly, her heart pounding with a mix of anxiety and foreboding. The day had felt unusually long, and the nagging feeling that something was amiss had been building in her gut all afternoon. As she stepped through the front door, the house felt eerily quiet, amplifying her unease. It was a stark contrast to the usual warmth she associated with home. She moved cautiously through the living room, her senses heightened. Everything seemed in its place, yet a strange tension hung in the air. With each step toward the staircase, memories of happier times, laughter, shared meals, and tender moments flashed through her mind. Those memories felt distant now, overshadowed by her growing suspicions about Ryan and Susan. As she climbed the stairs, a faint sound drifted through the hallway, muffled laughter that sent chills down her spine. It was a sound she had once cherished, now twisted into something foreboding. Her heart raced as she approached the bedroom door, the familiar wood grain looking foreign in that moment. She paused outside, listening intently. The laughter was punctuated by soft murmurs, the intimacy of the moment striking her like a slap. Gathering her courage, Lila pushed the door open just a crack. What she saw inside shattered her world. There was Ryan, her husband, lying on the bed, a look of bliss on his face. Next to him, draped in the sheets, was Susan, her mother. The sight was surreal, like a scene from a nightmare. Lila's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, time froze. Her heart felt like it had dropped into her stomach, the weight of betrayal crashing over her. Ryan and Susan were laughing, their faces close, completely unaware of Lila's presence. It was a moment filled with warmth and affection that had no place in the reality of Lila's world. Lila's instinct was to burst in, to confront them, to demand answers. But instead, she found herself rooted to the spot, paralyzed by shock. The betrayal cut deeper than any words could convey. Silently, she took a step back, her mind racing. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, but she fought them back. She didn't want them to see her pain, didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing they had broken her. With shaky legs, she turned away from the door, her heart heavy with despair. She moved down the hallway, each step feeling like an anchor dragging her deeper into a sea of sorrow. Outside, she closed the front door quietly behind her, as if trying to shut away the reality she had just witnessed. She slid into her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The world outside the window blurred as she drove aimlessly, the shock of the moment consuming her thoughts. Her mind was a chaotic whirlwind, questions and accusations swirling with disbelief. How could they do this? How could her mother betray her so completely? She felt lost, like a ghost haunting the very place she had once called home. She drove back to her office, the familiar streets now alien. Everything that once brought her comfort now felt tainted. Her heart was heavy, filled with a mix of anger, sorrow, and disbelief. Once at the office, Lila sat in her car for what felt like hours, staring at the darkened windows. She knew she should go inside, but the thought of facing anyone felt impossible. Instead, she remained motionless, a storm of emotions raging within her. The decision not to confront them immediately weighed heavily on her. Part of her wanted to scream, to rage against the betrayal, but she chose silence instead. In that moment of quiet chaos, she believed that maybe denying them the confrontation was a way to protect herself from the hurt. But deep down, she was aware that this denial would only deepen the wound. Lila's spiral had begun, and while she had walked away from that moment physically unscathed, The emotional toll would soon unravel everything she held dear. The scene she had witnessed would haunt her, a shadow looming over her life as she grappled with the truth of her shattered world. In the days that followed her devastating discovery, Lila withdrew deeper into herself. The emotional shock of finding Ryan and Susan together left her feeling isolated and numb. Instead of confronting them, she chose to escape her pain by immersing herself in work. Long hours at the office became her refuge. She filled her days with tasks, burying herself in deadlines and meetings, trying to ignore the turmoil brewing within. But the distraction didn't last. As she pushed herself harder, Lila began to neglect her own well-being. Each night, after coming home late from work, she turned to alcohol as a way to cope. What started as an occasional glass of wine quickly escalated into heavy drinking. The bottles piled up in the kitchen, a silent testament to her struggle. Drinking numbed the pain, but it also fueled her despair, leading her further into a dark place. Lila's mental state began to deteriorate. The more she avoided confronting the affair, the more trapped she felt in her own mind. Thoughts of betrayal haunted her, swirling like a storm she couldn't escape. As the days turned into weeks, she found herself unable to share her feelings with anyone, even her closest friends. Instead, she turned to her journal, where she began writing cryptic entries filled with sadness and confusion. Her words became a reflection of her internal struggle, pages filled with expressions of hopelessness, betrayal, and the overwhelming weight of her emotions. Each entry revealed her anguish, but also her desire to make sense of it all. "Why didn't I see it?" she wrote one night, tears blurring the ink. "I feel so alone." The journal became her only outlet, a place where she could pour out her heart without fear of judgment. Yet, with each word, Lila drifted further from reality, unable to find a way back to herself. The spiral into despair deepened, and her once vibrant spirit dimmed, leaving her feeling lost and broken. On a quiet evening, after yet another night of heavy drinking, Lila found herself in a dark place. The weight of her emotions had become unbearable, and the pain of betrayal felt like a crushing burden. That night, alone in her office, she felt completely consumed by despair. In a moment of deep hopelessness, she made the heartbreaking decision to end her suffering. With a heavy heart and blurred vision, Lila took the tragic step of hanging herself. It was a choice made in desperation, one that reflected the depth of her pain. The silence of the office surrounded her as she took this irreversible action, leaving behind all the dreams and love she once held. The next morning, when Lila didn't show up at work, her coworkers grew concerned. They had noticed her recent struggles, the late hours, and her growing withdrawal from social interactions. When they called her phone and received no answer, they decided to check on her. What they found in her office was a scene that would haunt them forever: Lila's lifeless body, a devastating reminder of the depths of her despair. The news of her death sent shockwaves through the community. Friends, family, and co-workers were left grappling with disbelief and grief. A police investigation was launched to understand the circumstances surrounding her tragic end. As detectives began to piece together her last days, they uncovered the painful truth of Lila's struggles, her feelings of betrayal, isolation, and hopelessness. In the wake of her death, questions arose about the relationships in her life. The investigation would eventually reveal the affair between Ryan and Susan, exposing the secrets that had led to this heartbreaking conclusion. The community, once vibrant and close-knit, now felt fractured, left to mourn the loss of a woman whose life had been marked by unrecognized pain and betrayal. When the police first arrived at the scene of Lila's death, they quickly classified it as a suicide. The circumstances seemed clear at first: a tragic end to a woman who appeared to be struggling with personal demons. However, as they began to sift through her belongings, they uncovered her journal, a collection of her thoughts and feelings that painted a much more complicated picture. The journal contained entries filled with anguish and hints of betrayal. Lila's suspicions about Ryan and Susan's relationship were evident. Phrases about her feelings of loneliness and her gut instincts regarding her husband and mother revealed a woman who was deeply troubled. This new information caught the attention of the detectives. What had seemed like a straightforward case now hinted at underlying issues that could not be ignored. As the investigation continued, the police brought in Ryan and Susan for questioning. Initially, both seemed cooperative, but small inconsistencies in their stories soon began to emerge. Ryan stumbled over details about his whereabouts on the day of Lila's death, while Susan's account of her visits became increasingly vague. The detectives pressed for clarity, and it became evident that their narratives were not aligning. Adding to the unraveling of their stories was testimony from Lila's close friend. She had observed Lila's growing despair and had even heard whispers of Lila's concerns about Ryan and Susan. When she spoke to the police, her insights painted a vivid picture of the emotional turmoil Lila had been facing. This information was a turning point for the investigation, leading detectives to focus on the affair that had remained hidden. As the truth began to surface, the community was stunned. The revelation of Ryan and Susan's affair shattered the trust many had in their relationships. Neighbors who once viewed them as a close family were now grappling with the reality of betrayal. The investigation not only exposed the affair, but also raised questions about the impact of their actions on Lila's tragic end, leaving the community to mourn not just the loss of Lila, but the destruction of their once harmonious lives. In the wake of Lila's tragic death, the community of Riverbend reacted with shock and anger. Ryan and Susan became pariahs, shunned by friends and neighbors who could hardly believe the betrayal that had unfolded. Ryan, once a respected member of the community, faced public shame. People who had once shared meals with him and offered friendship now looked at him with disdain. Rumors spread quickly, and whispers followed him wherever he went. Susan, too, faced a devastating backlash. As Lila's mother, she was viewed as the ultimate villain. Friends who had once welcomed her into their homes now turned their backs. Many felt betrayed not only by her actions, but also by the role she had played in tearing apart her own daughter's life. The shame and isolation were palpable, leaving Susan with few places to turn. She found herself alone, grappling with the reality of her choices. For both Ryan and Susan, the burden of guilt was overwhelming. They had not only betrayed Lila's trust, but had also contributed to her pain in an irreversible way. As the reality of their actions sank in, they were left to confront their own feelings of remorse. Ryan wrestled with the memories of happier times with Lila, haunted by the knowledge that he had chosen a fleeting connection over his marriage. Meanwhile, Susan was consumed by regret, realizing that her desire for attention had led to a devastating loss. Living with this guilt would be a lifelong struggle for both. They could not escape the consequences of their affair, nor the memory of a woman who had suffered because of their choices. The once close-knit community now felt fractured, a constant reminder of the pain that betrayal could inflict. As Ryan and Susan faced their new reality, the lessons of trust and loyalty hung heavily in the air, serving as a cautionary tale for others in Riverbend. The story of Lila, Ryan, and Susan serves as a stark reminder of the complexities of trust and betrayal. In a close-knit community like Riverbend, the impact of personal choices ripples far beyond individual lives. Lila's tragic end highlights the devastating consequences of emotional neglect and infidelity, leaving behind a wake of grief and unresolved questions. As Ryan and Susan grapple with their guilt, they must confront the reality of their actions and the lives forever altered by their betrayal. The community, once united, now navigates a fractured landscape, struggling to reconcile their memories of Lila with the painful truth that emerged after her death.